Alright, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This channel is for educational purposes, and we take a look at great theories of everything, cosmologies, all-encompassing theories. Try to figure out how to use them to the best of our ability to help us with our paradigm shifting, our awakening to 5D consciousness, our formation of a holistic worldview. Today is video number 566 on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. Larson was an American engineer, and he lived from 1898 until 1990. In about 1930, he began to have some epiphanies about how the universe operated, but he didn't put it down really until 1959. Went through a very long process of induction using gobs and gobs of kind of statistics, poring over data to arrive at a few general principles that he articulated in his two fundamental postulates. His first postulate states that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions, in discrete units, and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And his second and final postulate is really kind of what he plugs in that first postulate to. The first postulate is really original, and the second postulate is really borrowed from legacy science, which is that the universe conforms to the relations of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its primary magnitudes are absolute, and its geometry is Euclidean. And I have a few disputes with that second postulate, as do some of Larson's associates. But I don't really think that's the point. Larson was, I think looking for a consensus there with that second postulate, that I can use this to plug in my first postulate to arrive at a theoretical universe through a process of deduction, taking his general principles and arriving at specific ramifications of those principles. And then he took his theoretical universe and he compared it with the so-called empirical universe of modern science that they have arrived at through laboratory and observatory experiments and compiled in their scientific tables. Many times Larson is able to recreate the scientific tables strictly from theory. Now, after arriving at his theoretical universe, which I document in, he documents in his paper that he calls The Outline of the Deductive Development of the Reciprocal System, which I went through in about 15 videos that I did about 1.5 years ago, if you'd like to go back to that. He goes, through this deductive process, and eventually he writes books on chemistry, physics, astronomy. But his final book is actually on metaphysics, including philosophy, religion, psychology, biology. And he had 2 books also on economics. We're actually checking out his second book on economics right now in this video. The book is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. His other book on economics is called The Road to Full Employment. And Larson applies these things to economics in a, I think, very interesting way. First, he gets away from the sociological approach of economics, the social science approach, where it's kind of a bunch of pointy-headed academics trying to get their policies, crystallized into the economic, zeitgeist, or, the way of thinking of economists. And Larson is like, no, economics is a science. It's not a matter of your opinion. It's just like, engineering. It's basically just like if you're trying to build a bridge, your bridge needs to be compliant with the laws of physics, or else it's going to collapse. And your economic system also needs to be in compliance with the laws of physics, or else it's going to collapse. And, stop worrying about whether it's equitable or whether poor people are going to be victimized, or whether, whatever it is that your ideological or political issue is. You first have to construct an economic system that's going to work. You can worry about that other stuff later. And also, he articulates, goes back to the first principles. He talks a lot about Robinson Crusoe economics, economics of one person on a deserted island. Start from there, and then gradually introducing complications such as barter, money, employment into the system until we get to the modern system. He constructs a flowchart about how the economic system works. He arrives at the two reciprocal aspects of economics. In physics, we're talking about motion, a universe of motion. And we're talking about motion is the relationship between space and time. But in economics, those reciprocal aspects are production and consumption. And, articulates about 17 different principles that are pretty simple, and he contends that they are mathematically exact, and they always work. And so he constructs a economic system that will lead to a continual system of prosperity, where your economic system isn't doing the booms and busts. Those cycles are inevitable, but if you can kind of reduce the amplitude so that you're always humming, it's always humming at a good rate, nothing too high, nothing too low. And Larson recognizes that there is a way to kind of regulate what he calls the reservoirs, mostly banks and other storage facilities of whether money or goods, and regulate these things so that the economy is always humming. And it's pretty simple, but Larson tends to be pretty long-winded, just like me, and gets into a lot of weeds on his way to get to this. We are in the middle of chapter 19 right now, which is called Who Reaps the Harvest? In this chapter, Larson kind of debunks the whole idea of the kind of leftist, Marxist economists who are saying that it's constantly the big business is trying to, strip away all of the profit, to usurp all of their profits and to reduce the workers to their absolute lowest level. And Larson kind of confronts this idea from a mathematical or scientific viewpoint in this chapter. So we are, maybe, I don't know how far into this chapter we are, but we started it yesterday. If you want to get into the beginning of this book, you want to go back about 6 weeks in the archives and start with chapter 1. We're up here on chapter 19. And also, if you'd like to get a more detailed description of Larson's reciprocal system, from the postulates to their ramifications and to how to plug it into the more scientific subjects, check out any of or many of my first 474 videos on this subject, where I go into that in a little bit more detail. But for now, we're going to just read from chapter 19, Who Reaps the Harvest, from Larson's book, The Road to Permanent Prosperity. Before we dig into the basic principles to see why the employers have no control over the general wage level, let us first take a look at what has actually happened with respect to the division of the products of our economic efforts. In this case, as is true in general, we do not have to rely on abstract theory alone in reaching our conclusions. There are ample facts available for testing all theories. Everyone knows that production has increased tremendously since the advent of the Power Age. In order to check theory against actual experience, let us see what gain each of the two claimants, the worker and the supplier of capital, has made from this great increase in the output of the economic machine. According to the subsistence theory, the bulk of the gain must have accrued to the employers, that is, to the owners of the individual business enterprises. On the marginal productivity basis, we should affect to find a more equal division. But the suppliers of capital should still have the advantage, since the initiative, according to the theory, rests with the employer. Appraisal of the gains made by labor is a simple matter. All the worker wants to know is how he fares with respect to real wages, how much his buying power has been increased. On this point, there is no room for misunderstanding or differences of opinion. The gain in the last 100 years or so has been enormous. Estimates compiled by various analysts indicate that real wages have increased nearly 200% in this period of time. But even this does not tell the whole story. These compilations do not take fully into account the very great improvement in quality of products that has taken place simultaneously. But whether the actual gain has been 200% or 300% is not material in the present connection. The important point is that the wages of labor have increased drastically as a result of the increase in productivity. Now, how did the other claimant fare? The owner of capital also has only one standard by which he judges the adequacy of the wages that he obtains. This is the percentage rate of return on his investment. There is a tendency in economic circles to look at the percentage of the total product going to the suppliers of capital rather than at the rate of compensation received for each dollar of investment. But this amounts to nothing more than setting up an academic abstraction in place of a practical yardstick. No worker would listen with patience to an economist who tells him that a cut in real wages is of no consequence because more workers are now employed and consequently labor still gets the same percentage of the total output. It is equally unrealistic to expect an investor who finds the return on his capital dropping from 6% to 4%, to be consoled by assurance from the economists that the total amount of capital in use has doubled, and hence the suppliers of capital as a class are better off than they were before. The only significant item for either worker or investor is the rate of payment he received for the services that he supplies. We do not have enough detailed information to enable determining the rate of return from all types of capital investment directly, but we do have accurate and complete data on one specific item, the interest rate, and this gives us the answer for all kinds of capital, inasmuch as all uses for capital are directly competitive. Profits, for instance, cannot get very far out of line with interest rates because the investor has the option of lending his money or buying equities, and any maladjustment between interest and profits is promptly corrected by a diversion of the new money flow from the less profitable to the more profitable field. Theoretically, the average rate of profit should be somewhat higher than the interest rate because of the greater risk involved in equity investment. But it is doubtful whether this margin actually exists in practice. Many economists have concluded that the average businessman puts forth his proprietorial efforts for nothing. He gets no more return on his capital than he could get by lending his money to others. Quote, "The low level of corporate profitability is a puzzle to many observers," say Samuelson and Nordhaus. After analyzing the available statistics, C. Robinson reported in a book entitled Understanding Profits that, quote, "In the American economy, we have capital working for an average fee of 5 to 10% profit per dollar of investment," end quote. And he further states that, quote, "This modest fee tends to remain remarkably constant over a long period of time," end quote. The true rate of profit in the economy as a whole is even lower, as the business statistics on which such conclusions are based are heavily weighted toward the larger and more prosperous concerns, and do not adequately reflect the situation in the multitude of small companies and individual proprietorships. Many of the owners of small enterprise actually earn little or no profit, and are in business mainly as a means of earning a living on their own terms. So, we can determine the trend of remuneration for the services of capital in general by examining the interest rate. But the stability of the interest rate throughout the last 200 years, aside from short-term fluctuations, has been one of the most consistent of all economic phenomena. All observers have noted this situation. It is apparent that the owner of capital gets no more return on his investment, no more wages for the services of his capital than his predecessors did 100 years ago. If there has been any trend at all, it has been in the downward rather than upward. Or it has been downward rather than upward. And there is no indication that the situation is changing. Samuelson and Nordhaus give us these reports. American corporations have earned, on average, no more than their cost of capital over the last few decades. And the real interest rate has been trendless over the last 85 years. Where does this leave all of the theories of wages which put the employer in the dominating position? The owner of capital, who, in his capacity as an employer, is supposed to have the upper hand in wage determinations, even to the extent of lowering wages to mere subsistence levels, as the Marxists and many others would have us believe, gets no gain at all out of the great increase in productivity, whereas the real wages of the allegedly exploited worker have multiplied manyfold. Furthermore, the advent of the labor unions and the greater amount of public attention given to labor problems have not changed this situation in the least degree. The worker was getting all of the benefits of increased productivity before the unions even cut their eye teeth. As expressed by Samuelson and Nordhaus, quote, once cyclical influences on labor's share are removed, we can see no appreciable impact of unionization on the level of real wages in the United States, end quote. Obviously, something far beyond mere bargaining between employer and employees determines the real wage level. We cannot conceive of a bargaining process in which one of the participants never gets anything at all. The explanation is that capital competes with capital, not with labor. The price of capital is determined by the relative availability of capital and productive employment in which it can be used. Labor does not enter into this picture except when exhaustion of the labor supply limits the further use of capital. We frequently meet the contention that capital and labor are competing for jobs, as employers have the option of using labor-saving devices in lieu of labor, and will use more or less mechanical equipment depending on the labor price. This is another of the many economic misconceptions that arise from an inability to realize that the number of potential jobs for labor is unlimited, and the use of mechanical equipment therefore changes only the kind of work available, not the amount. The true facts will be obvious after we take the necessary steps to eliminate unemployment, but even in these days of imperfection, intensive use of capital is always correlated with high employment and high wages, not with low employment and low wages. When labor is fully utilized, the demand for capital is at a maximum, and wages get the benefit of the increased production. When production falls, both labor and capital lack employment. There is no sound basis for considering capital a competitor of labor. It is a tool of labor, and those who supply it receive a compensation based entirely on what it is worth, as determined by competition of the most aggressive and unrestrained character. The popular conception of market price as the fixed element out of which both labor and capital must draw their pay is entirely erroneous in application of the system as a whole. As was shown in Chapter 11, the normal market price is determined by production price, and any changes at the production end of the mechanism are promptly reflected in the goods market price. This normal market price, the price that would prevail in the absence of unbalancing forces arising from purchasing power reservoir transactions, is the sum of wages plus capital costs plus taxes. Capital costs are fixed by the competition of capital against capital. Taxes are fixed by those mysterious processes to which our legislators are addicted. Only wages have no external limitation. Consequently, they take up the entire residue. Real wages are equal to the market value of the products of the economy as a whole, less the fixed items of taxes and capital costs. No matter what the money wage may be, the price mechanism automatically adjusts the real wage to this unavoidable result. Ever since this residual claimant theory of wages was originally formulated, critics have argued that any element of costs can be considered the residue after all other charges have been satisfied, and hence wages are no more entitled to the residual status than any other cost element. Indeed, most economists accept the superficial viewpoint of the ordinary layman and consider profit as the residual share. In most current analysis, reports Yoder, economists are agreed that the only residual share is what is known as profit. No fixed rate of profits is imaginable precisely because it is a possible residue. Profits may or may not appear. This is the same old story of the trees obscuring the view of the forests. Yoder's statements are correct only in application to the individual case. They are completely erroneous in application to the system as a whole. An average rate of profit that is fixed from the short-term standpoint is imaginable, and it is much more than imaginable. It is an inevitable result of the way in which the economic system operates. If average profits fall below this fixed normal level, the supply of capital diminishes, and its price consequently rises. If average profits rise above the normal level, the supply of equity capital increases, and its price consequently drops back. It is rather odd that a profession which is so proud of its supply and demand theories and is inclined to apply them freely even where they have no actual relevance should be unable to see that this is a classic supply and demand situation. The essential point here is that regardless of how any individual firm may fare, taxes and capital costs, including profits, as a whole, are independent of productivity. Taxes are determined by what the government spends, not by what the economy produces. For the reasons that have been stated, capital costs at corresponding stages of the business cycle are practically constant, decade after decade. Only wages are free to increase or decrease in response to changes in productivity. The money wages may be resistant to change, but if they fail to reflect the productivity gains or losses, the real wages are automatically adjusted to the new conditions by the goods price mechanism. The division of the fruits of production is similar to the distribution of the assets of an estate. As wills are ordinarily written, there are some specific bequests which are fixed in amount irrespective of the actual size of the estate. These are analogous to the fixed taxes and capital costs. The remainder of the estate, after deducting these fixed items, goes to the residuary legatee. Similarly, the remainder of the products of the economy, after the fixed items are satisfied, goes to the workers, the residuary legatees of the economic system. This explains why wages get all of the benefit of improvements in productive efficiency, as the statistics clearly prove that they do. Returns on capital are still limited to the level established by competition, a level that has no relation to productive efficiency and therefore remains constant regardless of technological advances. As productivity improves, there is a constantly increasing residue that goes to the real owners of the economic machine, the workers. When we get down to the fundamentals, we find that it is the owner of capital, not the worker, whose remuneration is driven down to a subsistence level by remorseless competition. Because of the complexity of the modern economic organization, the owners of capital and the managers of the productive enterprises utilizing that capital do not ordinarily realize that average profits cannot rise above the subsistence level, but they are well aware that they do not. A survey of the attitude of business people toward existing economic conditions reports that the, quote, single biggest worry of business is the failure of profits to expand over the years. Arthur F. Burns expressed the same point in this manner, quote, perhaps the most serious obstacle we face to a higher rate of economic growth is the persistent decline in the rate of profit during the past 10 to 12 years. Unless the rate of profit is increased, I fear that our country will not succeed in attaining the rate of growth that we would like to have and can have. End quote. But the business community will have to reconcile itself to the situation that now exists and look elsewhere for growth stimulants, because a subsistence level of profits is inherent in the economic system. Okay, this next paragraph is rather long, and so I believe this is a strategic place to stop off and to return to tomorrow when we resume chapter 19 on who reaps the harvest of Larson's work called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a great